The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty garage windows as I tightened the last bolt on the Harley's engine. 67 years on this earth, and my hands still knew their way around a motorcycle better than most men half my age. This one was special, a 1984 Sportster I'd been restoring for Danny, my grandson. His 16th birthday was next week. The wrench slipped from my fingers and clattered to the concrete floor. He saved himself back then, not the others. Helen Morrison's voice cut through the garage wall like a blade. She was talking to her husband, Robert, on their back porch, maybe 20 feet away. I stood perfectly still, oil-stained rag in my hand. "That's what the article said," Robert replied, his voice lower, but still audible. Edgar Moore was the only survivor because he ran first. 47 years later, and the truth finally comes out, Helen continued. All this time, we thought he was a hero. Turns out, he left his squad to die in Vietnam. The rag dropped from my hand. I'd read the article that morning. 3 paragraphs in the Millbrook Gazette's local history section. Anonymous source. No byline. Just enough detail to feel authentic. Just vague enough to be impossible to verify quickly. Local resident Edgar Moore, long believed to be a decorated Vietnam veteran, may have abandoned his post during the 1971 Battle of Firebase Charlie, resulting in the deaths of 4 fellow soldiers. My chest tightened, but I didn't move. 47 years of neighbors waving from their porches, of handshakes at the hardware store, of thank you for your service at Memorial Day parades. Gone. Poor Danny, Helen was saying now. Imagine finding out your grandfather is a coward. I walked to the garage door and pulled it down slowly, the metal groaning against the tracks. The sound echoed in the growing darkness, but it couldn't drown out Helen's words. By the time I reached my kitchen, the phone was already ringing. I let it ring. Through the window, I could see the Morrisons still talking on their porch, gesturing toward my house. Helen was holding what looked like a folded newspaper, the article, probably, making sure everyone got their copy of the truth. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Martha used to read me the morning news before she passed 3 years ago. She would have known what to do. She would have known what to say. But Martha wasn't here anymore, and Danny wasn't coming for his birthday gift anymore, judging by how quickly news traveled in Millbrook. I opened the newspaper again and read the article for the 4th time. Every word was a nail in a coffin I'd thought was already sealed and buried. Firebase Charlie, April 15th, 1971. 4 dead soldiers, Michael Torres, James Sullivan, David Kim, and Martin Hughes. Martin Hughes. I closed my eyes and saw his face, 20 years old, red hair, freckles, always talking about the farm his family owned in Ohio, how he was going to modernize it when he got home. The phone rang again. I let it ring. Outside, the street lights were coming on, casting long shadows across the lawn Martha used to tend so carefully. Tomorrow, those shadows would probably be the only things in this town that still looked at me the same way. Podelitis expert, peripesite. The next morning, I walked to Miller's Hardware like I had every Tuesday for 15 years. Same route, same time, same purpose. Picking up parts for whatever project was keeping my hands busy. But everything felt different. Jim Miller barely looked up when I entered, his usual greeting replaced by a mumbled "morning" without eye contact. I found the spark plugs I needed and brought them to the counter. "That'll be $12.50, he said, still not meeting my eyes. I handed him exact change. Our fingers touched briefly as he took the bills, and he pulled his hand back like he'd touched something unclean. The change hit the counter with a metallic scatter instead of being placed in my palm. "Have a good day, Edgar," he said, but the words sounded hollow. I'd known Jim for 23 years. His daughter Sarah used to babysit Danny when he was little. We'd shared coffee and complained about the weather, the government, the price of everything. Now he was looking at me like I was a stranger. Outside, Mrs. Patterson was watering her flowers. She'd always waved, always asked about Danny, about how the motorcycle project was coming along. This time, she turned her back and walked inside her house before I reached the sidewalk. The walk home felt longer than usual. At the post office, Jenny behind the counter, who'd worked there since the Carter administration, handed me my mail without the usual smile. No, "How's your day, Mr. Moore?" No, "Tell Danny I said hello." Just silence and the sound of envelopes hitting the counter. I stopped at Rosie's Diner for lunch. I'd been eating there every Wednesday for 8 years. Always the same booth, always the meatloaf special. Rosie herself usually brought my coffee, asked about my week, complained about her arthritis. Today, she sent the new girl, a teenager who didn't know me, didn't know my order, didn't know that 3 days ago I was a respected member of this community. The booth behind me filled with voices I recognized: Bill Crawford from the gas station, Mary Louise from the bank, old Pete who ran the bait shop. Their conversation carried just loud enough for me to hear every word. 47 years, Bill was saying. 47 years of pretending to be something he wasn't. "Makes you wonder what else he's been lying about," Mary Louise added. "My brother died in Vietnam." Pete's voice was harder than the others. "Died fighting, not running." I finished my coffee and left a $5 tip on a $4 meal. The new girl would need it. Working for people who judge you based on stories they heard from other people who heard them from someone else, that's a hard way to make a living. The walk home was even longer. By evening, the phone had rung 6 times. I didn't answer any of them. Through the kitchen window, I could see lights on in houses where I used to be welcome. The Morrisons' porch light cast shadows that seemed to point directly at my front door. At 9:30, a car pulled into my driveway, Danny's blue Toyota. My chest tightened with something that might have been hope. He knocked instead of using his key. "Grandpa?" His voice was different, careful, like he was talking to someone he wasn't sure he knew anymore. I opened the door. He was holding his phone, the screen still lit. The article, probably, or maybe comments about the article, or comments about comments. "Is it true?" he asked. For 47 years, I'd never lied to this boy. Not when he asked why his parents got divorced. Not when he asked why Grandma Martha got sick. Not when he asked why life wasn't fair. "Come inside, Danny." He shook his head. "I just need to know if it's true." The porch light illuminated his face, and I could see Martha in his eyes. The same eyes that used to look at me like I hung the moon. Now they were full of something I'd never seen there before. Doubt. "The motorcycle's almost finished," I said instead. "Grandpa," his voice was firmer now, "is it true?" I looked at my grandson, this boy who'd spent every summer in my garage, who'd learned to change oil and adjust carburetors, who'd listened to my stories about honor and doing what's right even when it's hard. No, I said, it's not true. But he was already backing toward his car. I need some time to think, he said. I watched his taillights disappear down Elm Street, taking with them the last piece of the life I'd built in this town. The garage was dark, the Harley was half finished, and for the first time in 47 years, I felt truly alone. The phone rang again. This time, I unplugged it from the wall. The next morning, I walked to the garage with a different purpose. Not to work on Danny's motorcycle. That dream had died with his taillights disappearing down Elm Street. Instead, I climbed the wooden ladder to the storage loft I hadn't touched in 3 years. Martha used to say I kept too much junk up there. "Edgar, you're not a museum," she'd tease, watching me haul up another box of important papers. But some things aren't junk. Some things are proof. The dust made me cough as I pulled down boxes labeled in Martha's careful handwriting. Edgar's Army things, Vietnam papers, old photos. She'd organized my entire life, even the parts I'd tried to forget. I carried the boxes down one by one, my knees protesting with each step. 67 isn't 27, no matter how much your mind wants to pretend otherwise. The first box contained dress uniforms I'd never wear again, ribbons from ceremonies that felt like someone else's memories, and discharge papers with official seals and signatures. All the bureaucratic proof that Edgar Moore had served his country honorably. But bureaucracy wasn't going to save me from whispers at the hardware store. The second box was heavier. Letters from Martha during my tour. Photographs of young men who'd never grow old, and at the bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth that still smelled faintly of jungle rot. My field journal. I hadn't opened it in 20 years. The brown leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and brittle. My own handwriting stared back at me from April 1971, the words shaky from exhaustion or fear or both. Day 127, Firebase Charlie under mortar attack since 0300. Torres took shrapnel in the leg. Hughes and Sullivan are in the bunker with Kim. I'm in the communication post trying to reach base. Radio keeps cutting out. Day 128. Hughes found a way through the perimeter. Says he knows a route back to the LZ. We move at dawn. Torres can't walk. Someone has to stay with the radio until evac comes. Day 129. I stayed. They went. Radio finally got through to base around 1400. Helicopter came for Torres and me at 1600. No sign of the others. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. There it was, in my own 24-year-old handwriting, the truth that had been eating at me for 47 years. Not because I ran, because I stayed, and staying meant watching 4 friends disappear into jungle that swallowed them whole. I stayed with the wounded man. I stayed with the radio. I stayed because someone had to, and I was the ranking non-com. But staying alive when your friends don't makes you a coward in some people's eyes. Even your own, sometimes. At the bottom of the box, beneath newspaper clippings about missing soldiers and letters from families asking if I'd seen their sons, I found what I was looking for. A small metal tin, no bigger than a deck of cards. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch, was a Purple Heart medal and a folded piece of paper. The paper was an official commendation, signed by my commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Brennan. It recommended me for the Bronze Star for maintaining communication under enemy fire and ensuring the evacuation of a wounded soldier. The recommendation had been filed but never processed, lost in the chaos of a war that was ending badly for everyone involved. But more important than any medal was what I found in the third box, a manila envelope marked Personal Effects M. Hughes. Inside were letters Martin had written to his family but never sent, a photograph of a red-headed girl named Susan, and a hand-drawn map showing his planned route back to the landing zone. At the bottom of the envelope was a letter addressed to me. Edgar, if something happens and I don't make it, I want you to know it wasn't your fault. You had to stay with Torres. We all knew that. I'm going to try to get the others to safety, but if I can't, well, that's on me, not you. You're a good soldier and a good man. Don't let anyone tell you different. Your friend, Martin Hughes. I read the letter 3 times before I understood what I was holding. Martin Hughes hadn't died at Firebase Charlie. He'd written this letter after April 15th, 1971. The handwriting was different from his earlier letters, older somehow, more careful. And at the bottom, in pencil, was an address in Columbus, Ohio. My hands moved without conscious thought, reaching for the phone before I remembered I'd unplugged it. I plugged it back in and dialed information. Columbus, Ohio. Martin Hughes on Riverside Drive. The operator found 3 M. Hughes listings. I called the first number. An elderly woman's voice answered, "Hello? Is Martin Hughes available? May I ask who's calling?" "Edgar Moore, from the war." There was a long pause, then the sound of the phone being passed to another person. Edgar Moore? The voice was older now, rougher, but I'd have known it anywhere. "Jesus Christ, Edgar, is it really you?" "Hello, Martin. I thought you were dead, you son of a bitch. I tried to find you after I got back, but the Army said you'd been discharged and they couldn't give me information." My throat was tight. "You made it out." "Barely. Took me 3 days to find the LZ. Kim and Sullivan didn't make it. Got separated the first night, and I never saw them again. But Torres, the guy you stayed with, he made it home. Got that leg fixed up and runs a garage in Phoenix now." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "Martin, there's something I need to tell you, and I need your help." I told him about the article, about Danny, about a town that had decided I was a coward based on lies someone had fed to a newspaper. When I finished, Martin was quiet for a long moment. "Edgar," he said finally, "I've got something to show you. Can you get to Columbus?" "When?" "Tomorrow, if you can. This has gone on long enough." I looked around the garage at the scattered boxes, the evidence of a life lived honestly, the truth that had been waiting 47 years to speak. "I'll be there." After I hung up, I walked to the workbench where Danny's motorcycle waited. I picked up my tools and got back to work. Not because I thought he'd come back for it, but because some promises are worth keeping even when no one's watching. The phone rang twice that evening. I let it ring both times. Tomorrow, I was going to find out what Martin Hughes had been keeping all these years, and maybe, just maybe, I was going to get my life back. The drive to Columbus took 4 hours, but it felt like traveling back in time. Every mile marker was another year peeled away. Every highway sign pointing toward a past I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it had never happened. Martin lived in a modest ranch house with a well-tended garden and an American flag hanging from the front porch. When he opened the door, I saw the boy I'd known in Vietnam, older now, grayer, carrying the weight of 47 years, but unmistakably him. The same eyes, the same crooked smile that had kept us all sane during the worst nights of our lives. "Edgar Moore," he said, gripping my hand with both of his, "you haven't changed a damn bit." That was a lie, and we both knew it. We'd both changed in ways that had nothing to do with gray hair and creaking joints. His wife, Susan, the red-headed girl from the photograph, made coffee and disappeared tactfully into another room. Martin led me to his study, a small room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large oak desk. "Before we talk about what's happening to you now," he said, "there's something I need to show you, something I should have shown you 30 years ago." He pulled out a thick manila folder from the desk drawer. Inside were dozens of letters, newspaper clippings, and official-looking documents. After I got back from Vietnam, I spent 20 years trying to find out what happened to Kim and Sullivan. The Army said they were MIA, presumed dead. Their families never got answers, but I couldn't let it go. He spread the documents across the desk. "I hired a private investigator in 1995. Cost me $15,000 I didn't have, but he found something." The first document was a letter from the Department of Defense dated 1996. It stated that Corporal David Kim and Private James Sullivan had been captured after becoming separated from their unit on April 16, 1971. They had died in a North Vietnamese prison camp in 1973. "They didn't die because of anything we did or didn't do at Firebase Charlie," Martin said. "They died because war is hell, and sometimes good men don't make it home. But here's the thing, Edgar. None of us ran. None of us abandoned our post. We followed orders, made tactical decisions, and survived when others didn't." The second document was more interesting, a military investigation report, classified until 1995, detailing the events at Firebase Charlie. According to the report, the communication post had been critical to coordinating the evacuation of 7 other wounded soldiers from the area. My decision to stay with Torres and maintain radio contact had directly resulted in those evacuations being successful. "You saved 15 men that day, Edgar. 15 men who went home to their families because you stayed at that radio." But the third document made my blood run cold. It was a memo dated 3 months ago, sent from the office of Congressman Graham Whitfield to the Millbrook Gazette. The memo contained background information on several local veterans, including a heavily edited and completely falsified account of the Firebase Charlie incident. "Graham Whitfield," I said, the name tasting bitter in my mouth. "You know him? He's not a congressman. He's a city councilman in Millbrook, but he's running for state senate this year." I thought back to the conversation I'd had with him 6 months ago in the parking lot of the Legion Hall. He wanted me to endorse him, wanted me to speak at his campaign rallies, use my military service to legitimize his candidacy. Martin leaned back in his chair. "And you said no." I said, "Hell no. The man's a snake. He's been taking kickbacks from developers for years, pushing through zoning changes that benefit his friends. I told him I wouldn't spit on him if he was on fire." "Well," Martin said grimly, "looks like he found another way to neutralize your influence." I read the memo again, noting how cleverly it was constructed, just enough truth mixed with lies to make it believable. References to real dates, real battles, real casualties. But the core facts were inverted. The hero became the coward. The man who stayed became the man who ran. How did you get this? Martin smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Susan's cousin works for the phone company. She noticed some unusual long-distance charges on Whitfield's office account. Multiple calls to the same number in Washington. Turns out it was a PR firm that specializes in opposition research. They've been digging up dirt on anyone who might oppose Whitfield's Senate run, including me, especially you. Edgar, you don't realize how much influence you have in that town. People respect you. When you speak, they listen. Whitfield couldn't risk you campaigning against him. I thought about Danny backing away from my front door, about Jim Miller avoiding eye contact, about the whispers at Rosie's diner. Well, he got what he wanted. I couldn't influence a dog to chase a cat right now. Maybe, Martin said, or maybe we can change that. He pulled out one more document, a letter signed by Lieutenant Colonel James Brennan, now retired General Brennan, living in Arlington, Virginia. I tracked down our old commanding officer last month, sent him copies of everything, the investigation report, the recommendation for your Bronze Star, the truth about Firebase Charlie. He wants to meet with you. Martin, that was 47 years ago. Nobody cares about an old war anymore. Bullshit. Martin's voice was sharp. People care about the truth. They care about honor. And they sure as hell care when politicians lie to them for personal gain. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking his backyard. Edgar, I've been carrying guilt about Firebase Charlie for 47 years. Guilt that I couldn't save Kim and Sullivan. Guilt that I made it out when they didn't. Guilt that I never found you afterward to tell you it wasn't your fault. He turned back to me. But mostly, I've been carrying guilt that I let the world think you were anything less than a hero. Because that's what you were, Edgar. That's what you are. I looked at the documents spread across his desk, the evidence of my innocence, the proof of Whitfield's deception, the tools that might give me back my life. But I also thought about Danny's face in the porch light, about the doubt in his eyes, about a 16-year-old boy who'd been taught that his grandfather was a man of honor. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Martin opened another drawer and pulled out a business card. Lucy Chin, investigative reporter for the Columbus Dispatch. She's been following Whitfield's campaign, looking into some irregularities. She's very interested in meeting with both of us. And then what? Then we tell the truth, all of it. The real story of Firebase Charlie, the documents proving Whitfield fabricated the story, the evidence of his corruption. We let the chips fall where they may. I picked up the business card and studied it. Lucy Chin. If I called this number, there would be no going back. The quiet life I'd built in Millbrook would be over, one way or another. Either I'd be vindicated or I'd be destroyed even more thoroughly. But then I thought about that motorcycle in my garage, half finished and waiting for a boy who might never trust me again. I thought about Martha's voice saying, "Edgar, you're not a museum," and realized she was wrong. I had become a museum, a dusty collection of old memories and buried truths, kept in the dark where no one could see them. "There's something else," Martin said quietly. "Torres, The guy you stayed with at Firebase Charlie, he's flying in tomorrow morning. Turns out he's been following your story too. Someone sent him that newspaper article, and he's madder than hell about it. Someone sent him the article. Same PR firm that fed it to the newspaper in the first place. They've been spreading it around to veteran groups, trying to make sure it gets maximum exposure. But Torres has been telling everyone who'll listen that the story is bullshit. And he's got medical records proving he was wounded and evacuated from Firebase Charlie on April 15th, 1971. I felt something I hadn't experienced in days. Hope. Martin, if we do this, if we go public with all of this evidence, Whitfield will fight back. He's got money, connections, lawyers. This could get ugly. Martin walked over to a photograph hanging on the wall, our old squad, taken a week before Firebase Charlie. 8 young faces staring at the camera with the kind of confidence that only comes from not knowing what's waiting for you. Edgar, Kim and Sullivan died in a prison camp because they wouldn't give up information about troop movements. They died protecting other soldiers, other Americans. They died with honor. He turned back to me. The least we can do is live with some. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on Lucy Chen's business card. Ms. Chen? This is Edgar Moore. I have a story you might be interested in. That evening, as I drove back toward Millbrook, I thought about Danny and the conversation we were going to have. I thought about the people in my town who'd turned their backs on me based on lies, and wondered how many of them would have the courage to admit they'd been wrong. But mostly, I thought about Martin's words. The least we can do is live with some honor. For 47 years, I'd been living with silence. Tomorrow, I was going to start living with truth. The meeting with Lucy Chen took place in a conference room at the Columbus Dispatch that smelled like coffee and old newspapers. Martin, Torres, and I sat on one side of a long table while Lucy and her editor, a thin man named David Walsh, sat across from us with recording equipment and legal pads. Torres looked exactly like what he was, a successful businessman who'd built something from nothing. Clean-shaven, expensive suit, confident handshake. But when he rolled up his sleeve to show the scar from the shrapnel that had torn through his leg at Firebase Charlie, I saw the 20-year-old soldier I'd helped carry to the evacuation helicopter. Let me be crystal clear about something, Torres said, looking directly into Lucy's camera. Edgar Moore didn't run from anything. He saved my life. If he'd left that radio post, I'd have bled out in a bunker while waiting for a helicopter that would never have found us. Lucy took notes while Torres spoke, occasionally asking questions that proved she'd done her homework. She knew about Firebase Charlie, about the tactical situation, about the decisions we'd had to make in circumstances that no training manual could have prepared us for. Mr. Moore, she said, turning to me, the article in the Millbrook Gazette claims you were the only survivor because you abandoned your post. Can you respond to that? I pulled out my field journal and read directly from the entries I'd written 47 years ago. My voice was steady, but my hand shook slightly as I turned the pages. Day 129. I stayed. They went. Radio finally got through to base around 1400 hours. You stayed? Lucy repeated. Someone had to. Torres couldn't walk. The radio was our only link to evacuation. Martin and the others had a better chance of reaching the landing zone on foot. We all knew that. Martin leaned forward. Edgar, tell her about the other evacuations. I looked at the classified report he'd obtained, then at Lucy. According to military records that weren't declassified until 1995, my maintaining radio contact resulted in the successful evacuation of 7 other wounded soldiers from Firebase Charlie and surrounding positions. 15 men total went home because that radio stayed operational. Lucy's editor looked up from his notes. And you've never talked about this publicly? What was I supposed to say? That I did my job while other men died doing theirs? That surviving made me some kind of hero? I shook my head. I came home. Others didn't. That's not heroism. It's luck. Or duty, Torres said quietly, which is what heroes call luck when they don't want credit for doing the right thing. Lucy spread the documents across the table. The military investigation, the falsified memo from Whitfield's office, the phone record showing calls to the Washington PR firm, the evidence of deliberate character assassination. This is quite a story, she said. A local politician fabricating war records to discredit a potential opponent. But I need to ask, why now? Why are you coming forward 47 years later? I thought about Danny's face in the porch light, about the doubt in his eyes, about a town that had turned its back on me based on lies. Because sometimes the truth is worth more than a quiet life, I said, and because there's a 16-year-old boy who needs to know that his grandfather isn't a coward. The interview lasted 3 hours. By the time we finished, Lucy had enough material for a series of articles that would run through the week. But more important, she had contacts at the Associated Press who would pick up the story and run it nationally. Mr. Moore, she said as we prepared to leave, I should warn you that Whitfield will fight back, hard. He's got a lot to lose. So do I said. The difference is, I've already lost most of it. Martin drove me back to his house, where we spent the evening going through more documents and preparing for what was coming. Susan cooked dinner and listened while we talked about the war, about the friends we'd lost, about the weight of carrying other men's stories for 47 years. You should call your grandson, Martin said as we sat on his back porch with beers and watched the sun set. Tell him what's happening before he reads it in the newspaper. I pulled out my phone and stared at Danny's number. We hadn't spoken since that night on my front porch, when he'd asked if the story was true and then driven away before I could explain. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. Hello? Danny, it's Grandpa. Silence. I know you don't want to talk to me right now, but there are some things you need to know. Things that are going to be in the newspapers tomorrow. Grandpa, The story about Firebase Charlie was a lie. A deliberate lie told by a politician who wanted to destroy my reputation because I wouldn't support his campaign. More silence then. How do you know it was a lie? Because I have proof. Documents, witness statements, military records. I have the truth, Danny. And tomorrow, everyone else is going to have it too. I told him about Martin, about Torres, about the investigation that had taken 20 years to complete. I told him about General Brennan, who was flying in the next day to personally vouch for my service record. I told him about the evidence that would prove Graham Whitfield had orchestrated the whole thing. When I finished, Danny was quiet for a long time. Grandpa, he said finally, I'm sorry. I should have believed you. You're 16 years old. You're supposed to question everything, especially when it doesn't make sense. I'm not angry with you, Danny. I'm proud of you for thinking for yourself. Can I come over tomorrow, after the story comes out? Your motorcycle is still waiting for you, I said. It needs a test drive. The next morning, Lucy Chen's story appeared on the front page of the Columbus Dispatch with the headline, Vietnam Veteran Smeared by Political Opponent. By noon, it had been picked up by the Associated Press, CNN, and Fox News. By evening, it was trending on social media with hashtags like #Justice for Edgar and #Vietnam Hero. But the story that mattered most to me appeared in the Millbrook Gazette the following day. A full apology, written by the editor himself, acknowledging that they had published false information without proper verification. The article included excerpts from Lucy Chen's investigation, quotes from General Brennan confirming my service record, and a statement from Torres describing how I had saved his life. Graham Whitfield's campaign issued a statement denying any involvement, but the phone records and the memo from his office were damning evidence that spoke for themselves. Within a week, he had withdrawn from the Senate race and announced he would not seek re-election to the city council. The phone calls started coming that afternoon. Jim Miller from the hardware store apologizing and asking if I needed anything. Mrs. Patterson from next door, bringing over a casserole and looking embarrassed about turning her back on me. Jenny from the post office asking if I'd like to join the Veterans Day Planning Committee. But the call that mattered most came from a familiar voice I hadn't heard in months. Grandpa, I'm outside. Can I come in? I opened the front door to find Danny standing on my porch, holding a newspaper and wearing a smile that reminded me why I'd spent 47 years keeping the truth buried. Some things are worth protecting even when the cost is your own reputation. The motorcycle's in the garage, I said. I know, but first I want to hear the real story. From you, all of it. We walked to the garage together, past the workbench where his birthday gift waited, past the boxes of documents that had finally given up their secrets, to 2 folding chairs where grandfather and grandson could sit and talk about war and truth and the weight of carrying other men's stories. It starts with Firebase Charlie, I said, April 15th, 1971. And it ends with you understanding that sometimes doing the right thing means everyone thinks you did the wrong thing. Danny opened the newspaper to Lucy Chen's article and set it aside. Tell me, he said. So I did. I told him about Martin Hughes and David Kim and James Sullivan, about Torres bleeding in a bunker while mortars fell like rain, about staying at a radio when every instinct told me to run, about 15 men who went home to their families because someone stayed behind to guide the helicopters in. I told him about the weight of survivors' guilt, about 47 years of wondering if I'd made the right choice, about the difference between being a hero and just doing your job when the job needed doing. And I told him about Graham Whitfield, about political ambition that would destroy a man's reputation for personal gain, about the importance of standing up to bullies even when the cost is everything you've built. When I finished, Danny was quiet for a long time. Grandpa, he said finally, I want to learn how to fix motorcycles. Really fix them. Not just change the oil and check the spark plugs. That takes patience, I said, and strong hands. and the willingness to keep working when everyone thinks you should give up. Danny smiled and picked up a wrench from the workbench. Sounds like something I learned from my grandfather. Outside, the sun was setting over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the town that had turned its back on me, and then, slowly, reluctantly, welcomed me home. The phone would ring again tonight. More apologies, more invitations, more people wanting to make amends for believing lies about a man they'd known for decades. But for now, it was just me and Danny and a 1984 Harley that needed finishing. Some gifts are worth completing, even when you're not sure they'll be accepted. Some stories are worth telling, even when the truth comes 47 years too late. And sometimes the best conversations happen in a garage, between a grandfather and grandson, over the sound of tools working on something that matters. 3 weeks after Lucy Chen's story broke, Millbrook looked the same, but felt different. The same houses lined the same streets, the same American flags hung from the same porches, but the weight that had pressed down on my shoulders for 47 years was gone. I was in the garage, putting the finishing touches on Danny's motorcycle, when I heard footsteps on the graveled driveway. Through the open door, I could see General James Brennan walking toward me, still carrying himself like the soldier he'd been 50 years ago. "Permission to enter your workshop, Sergeant Moore?" I set down my wrench and stood straighter than I had in years. "Granted, sir, though it's just Edgar now." Brennan smiled and extended his hand. "James, I think we're both civilians now." He looked around the garage, taking in the motorcycle, the toolboxes, the life I'd built with my hands after the war ended. His eyes stopped on the workbench where I'd laid out my field journal, the Purple Heart, and the commendation he'd written but never processed. "I owe you an apology, Edgar. That Bronze Star should have been approved 47 years ago. The paperwork got lost in the chaos of withdrawal, and by the time I realized what had happened, you'd disappeared into civilian life." "I didn't disappear," I said. "I just went home." "Without any recognition for what you'd done, without any acknowledgement that you'd saved 15 lives by staying at that radio." I picked up a clean rag and wiped oil from my hands. "General, with respect, recognition isn't why we stayed. We stayed because Torres couldn't walk and someone had to guide those helicopters in. That's not heroism. It's just what the situation required." Brennan laughed, a sound that carried decades of command decisions and impossible choices. "Edgar, do you know why I became a career officer? Why I spent 35 years in the Army after Vietnam?" "No, sir. Because of men like you. Men who did what the situation required without counting the cost. Men who understood that duty isn't about glory. It's about showing up when showing up matters." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. "This is 47 years overdue." Inside was a Bronze Star medal, gleaming as if it had been cast yesterday. The citation read, "For meritorious service in connection with military operations against a hostile force. Sergeant Edgar Moore maintained vital communication links under enemy fire, directly resulting in the successful evacuation of wounded personnel and the saving of multiple lives." "I can't accept this," I said. "You already earned it." "I'm just delivering it." The garage fell quiet, except for the sound of wind moving through the oak tree Martha had planted in our backyard 30 years ago. I thought about the young man who'd sat in a bunker with a wounded soldier and a crackling radio, believing he was just doing his job. I thought about the old man who'd carried the weight of that day for 47 years, wondering if he'd made the right choice. "There's something else," Brennan said. "The Army is opening a new exhibit at the Vietnam Memorial next month. Stories of ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things. They want to include Firebase Charlie." "I don't know about that, General." "Think about it. Not for yourself. For Martin Hughes, for David Kim and James Sullivan, for all the men whose stories never got told because the war ended badly and everyone wanted to forget." Before I could answer, another car pulled into the driveway. Danny's Toyota, followed by a pickup truck I didn't recognize. Danny got out of his car and walked toward the garage, but he wasn't alone. Martin Hughes climbed out of the pickup, along with a man I hadn't seen in 47 years. Torres looked older, grayer, but he still had the confident bearing of someone who'd built a successful life from nothing. He walked with a slight limp, a reminder of the shrapnel that had torn through his leg at Firebase Charlie. "I hope you don't mind the invasion," Martin said. "But Torres flew in from Phoenix, and we thought it was time for a proper reunion." Danny stood slightly apart from the three old soldiers, watching us with the fascination of someone discovering that his grandfather had lived multiple lives. "Torres," I said, extending my hand, "you look good for a man who was supposed to bleed out in a Vietnamese bunker." He gripped my hand with both of his. "Edgar, I've been wanting to say something to you for 47 years. Thank you, not just for staying with me, but for making the hard choice when the hard choice needed making. You would have done the same. Maybe, but you're the one who actually did it." General Brennan stepped forward. "Gentlemen, I have a proposal. The Army wants to honor the men of Firebase Charlie properly, all of them, the living and the dead. Would you consider coming to Washington next month for the dedication?" Martin and Torres looked at me. The decision was mine to make. I thought about David Kim and James Sullivan, about young men who died in a prison camp thousands of miles from home. I thought about the families who'd never gotten proper answers, who'd spent decades wondering what had happened to their sons. What would we have to do? "Tell the truth," Brennan said simply. "Tell the real story of Firebase Charlie. Help people understand what happened there and why it mattered." Through the garage doorway, I could see neighbors working in their yards, cars passing on Elm Street, life continuing in the town that had briefly turned its back on me and then welcomed me home. This was my world now, small, quiet, honest. But for 47 years, I'd carried the stories of men who'd never gotten the chance to build quiet lives. "Danny," I said, turning to my grandson, "what do you think?" He looked surprised to be asked. "Me? You're part of this story, too. You had to live with people thinking your grandfather was a coward. You get a vote?" Danny was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think Grandma Martha would have said you should go. She always told me that some stories are too important to keep to yourself." "Martha," I could almost hear her voice. "Edgar, you're not a museum." But maybe being a museum wasn't such a bad thing if it meant preserving the truth for people who needed to hear it. "All right," I said to Brennan, "we'll go to Washington." Over the next 2 hours, the garage became a time machine. 4 old soldiers and 1 teenager sat on folding chairs and workbenches, sharing stories that had been locked away for decades. Martin talked about his 3-day journey through the jungle, about the guilt he'd carried for not being able to save Kim and Sullivan. Torres described the months of physical therapy that had taught him to walk again, and the business he'd built with hands that remembered how to fix things. I told them about Martha, about the life we'd built in Millbrook, about 47 years of carrying fire-based Charlie in silence, about the weight of survivor's guilt and the strange comfort of ordinary days. Danny listened to all of it, asking questions that showed he understood the weight of what he was hearing. "Grandpa," he said during a lull in the conversation, "can I ask you something? Anything. When that story came out in the newspaper, when everyone in town believed it, were you angry?" I thought about that question for a long time. I was hurt, disappointed, but not really angry. People believe what makes sense to them, and in their experience, heroes don't usually live quiet lives in small towns. They're usually dead or famous or both. But you are a hero. No, Danny, heroes are what we call ordinary people who do extraordinary things when extraordinary things need doing. The rest of the time, we're just people trying to live decent lives and fix motorcycles and remember our friends. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to practical matters: the Washington ceremony, the Vietnam Memorial exhibit, the decision to finally let the public story catch up to the private truth. But the moment that mattered most came near sunset, when Torres stood up and walked to the motorcycle I'd been restoring. "This for your grandson?" His 16th birthday present, about 3 weeks late. Torres ran his hand over the gas tank, admiring the work. "Beautiful bike. Mind if I take a look at the engine?" "Be my guest." He leaned over the motor, checking my work with the eye of someone who'd spent 47 years building things. "Edgar, this is perfect. Professional quality. You did this all yourself." "Had some help from Danny. He's got good hands." Torres straightened up and looked at my grandson. "Danny, your grandfather ever tell you that he fixed motorcycles in Vietnam?" Danny shook his head. "Unit transportation specialist. Best mechanic in the company. Could make anything run, even when it was held together with wire and prayers." Torres smiled. "Some skills you never lose." As the sun began to set, Martin and Torres prepared to leave. General Brennan shook hands with all of us and promised to send details about the Washington ceremony. "Edgar," he said as he reached his car, "one more thing. The exhibit will include a section for family members. If Danny would like to attend the dedication, we'd be honored to have him." After everyone left, Danny and I stood alone in the garage with his completed motorcycle. "Want to take it for a test ride?" I asked. He climbed onto the bike and turned the key. The engine caught immediately, purring with the satisfaction of something built properly and with care. "Grandpa, I'm sorry I doubted you." "Danny, doubt is healthy. It means you think for yourself. Just remember, when someone tells you a story about someone you know, ask yourself if it matches what you've seen with your own eyes." He revved the engine gently, feeling the power beneath him. "Can you teach me to build one from scratch? That takes time, patience, the willingness to start over when you make mistakes." "Sounds like something worth learning." Danny rode the motorcycle up and down our street as darkness fell, the headlight cutting through the gathering dusk. Neighbors came out to watch. The same neighbors who turned their backs on me 3 weeks earlier. Now they waved and called out compliments on the bike, on Danny's careful riding, on the quality of the restoration. People are funny that way. They want to believe in heroes, but they're suspicious of anyone who might actually be one. They want stories with clear villains and obvious victims, but real life is messier than that. Real heroes are usually just people who showed up when showing up mattered, then went home and lived quiet lives and hoped nobody would make too big a deal about it. But sometimes the quiet life gets interrupted. Sometimes the past reaches out and demands to be acknowledged. Sometimes 16-year-old boys need to know that their grandfathers are men of honor, and sometimes that knowledge is worth more than privacy. That night, I called Lucy Chin to thank her for her careful reporting and fair treatment of a complicated story. I called Jim Miller at the hardware store to order parts for another motorcycle, this one for myself. And I called the number General Brennan had given me to confirm that Danny and I would attend the dedication ceremony in Washington. Before bed, I walked out to the garage one more time. The workbench was clean, the tools organized, the boxes of documents put away. But on the pegboard above the bench, I'd hung the Bronze Star Medal next to a photograph of 8 young soldiers taken a week before Firebase Charlie. Some stories are worth keeping private. Others are worth sharing, when the sharing serves a purpose larger than yourself. In 3 weeks, Danny and I would stand at the Vietnam Memorial while General Brennan told the real story of Firebase Charlie to a crowd of strangers. We'd honor the memory of David Kim and James Sullivan, acknowledge the sacrifice of men who didn't make it home, and help people understand that heroism usually looks like doing your job when your job happens to be impossible. But tonight, we were just a grandfather and grandson in a small town in Ohio, surrounded by the tools and projects and quiet satisfactions of a life lived honestly. The motorcycle was finished, the story was told, and the truth had finally caught up to the silence I'd been carrying for 47 years. Some gifts are worth the wait. Some stories are worth the telling. And sometimes the most important conversations happen in a garage, between people who understand that honor isn't about glory, it's about showing up when showing up matters, then going home and living decent lives and hoping that's enough. It was enough for Martha. It was enough for Danny. And after 47 years of wondering, it was finally enough for me.